You're standing on a sun-baked plain somewhere along the Rhine frontier. The clang of armor, the smell of iron and sweat, the thunder of marching feet, it all vibrates through the soil. And there, between the soldier's towering legs, a child laughs. His helmet wobbles on his tiny head, his boots calliope spattered with dust and blood. The legion roars in delight, calling him Caligula, Little Boots, the army's cherished mascot. You smile too, but you don't yet know that this laughing boy will one day make all of Rome tremble. Before we go deeper into this dark tale of innocence and empire, if you find yourself drawn to these buried corners of history, consider joining this journey. Like this video, share it with a fellow history lover, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's extraordinary voices from Karachi, Madrid, Sao Paulo, and Seoul, thousands of years apart, yet gathered here to witness the ghosts of Rome. When Caligula was born in 12 CE, the empire was at its zenith, shimmering with marble and conquest. His father, Germanicus, was everything Rome idolized, handsome, victorious, adored by the people and the legions alike. Wherever he marched, loyalty followed. Wherever he spoke, hearts lifted. The Senate whispered that if destiny were fair, Germanicus, not the brooding Emperor Tiberius, should rule, and that whisper would become a curse. The boy's early years were a parade of triumphs. He sat on his father's shoulders during victory marches through the Rhine camps, tiny hands gripping the laurels that crowned Germanicus's brow. Soldiers offered him toy swords carved from olive wood. When he mimicked the salute, entire cohorts erupted in laughter. To the men, he was a lucky charm. To Rome, a living symbol of continuity. Yet, within the marble palaces of the capital, luck was an invitation to envy. Germanicus's popularity eclipsed the emperor's fragile pride. Tiberius watched from his villa on Capri, surrounded by informers who whispered that Germanicus sought the throne. When Germanicus fell suddenly ill in Syria, writhing with fever, cursing unseen enemies, rumors spread that he'd been poisoned on imperial orders. His last words, recorded by Tacitus, were a father's plea: "Avenge me, if you can." The boy was 6 when he saw the funeral procession. The streets of Rome overflowed with mourners, their cries echoing through the forum like thunder trapped between stone walls. Caligula clung to his mother, Agrippina the elder, as ashes drifted from the pyre like dark snow. In that smoke, something inside him hardened the first ember of suspicion. Agrippina was proud, fierce, and dangerously outspoken. She accused Tiberius of murder, and for that defiance she paid the Roman price: exile. Her sons, Caligula's brothers, were dragged away one by one, accused of treason, left to starve in prison cells. The young boy who had once been paraded through legions now wandered empty corridors, hearing doors slam behind those he loved. He learned that in Rome, affection was fatal. Tiberius spared the boy but kept him close. The emperor summoned Caligula to live on the island of Capri, beautiful, isolated, and filled with dread. Ancient sources describe Capri as a paradise that smelled of salt and jasmine, yet its marble courtyards hid unspeakable cruelty. Senators accused of conspiracy were hurled from cliffs into the sea below. Servants vanished overnight, and the child learned to smile through terror. He studied the emperor's moods like a priest reading omens. When Tiberius laughed, Caligula laughed louder. When the old man wept, Caligula knelt in silence. He became, as one historian put it, a serpent raised in a serpent's nest. No one knows exactly what he saw on that island, whether he witnessed executions or worse, but all agree he never forgot the taste of fear. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, the boy who had once played among soldiers had become a man with a polished mask. The empire rejoiced at his coronation. Coins were minted with his smiling face, temples rang with prayers of gratitude. At last, people said, the blood of Germanicus returns to rule. Caligula opened the prisons, paid bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and staged games that glittered brighter than any in living memory. For 7 months, Rome believed it had been reborn. But beneath the laurel crown lay something restless. Nights found the young emperor wandering his palace alone, staring at the moonlit statues of gods whose eyes seemed to follow him. He would murmur to them half in devotion, half in challenge, testing the sound of his own divinity. "Am I not your equal?" he once whispered to a marble Jupiter. Servants heard it and said nothing. The empire had given him everything, its armies, its adoration, its throne. But it had taken everything first. Father, mother, brothers, all gone to the machinery of power. And now, as he stood in the same marble halls that had swallowed his family, Caligula seemed to understand the one lesson Rome had taught him since childhood. In this world, love is weakness, and mercy is death. Outside, the people still cheered his name. Inside, the golden boy stared into polished bronze and saw the reflection of every betrayal he'd endured. The child in the toy armor was gone. In his place stood an emperor and a void ready to devour the world. The palace lamps flickered, and somewhere deep in the corridors, laughter echoed. Low, uncertain, almost human. It was the sound of something awakening the first tremor of a rain that would turn Rome's heart to ash. The fever began quietly. What started as a faint trembling of the hands turned into nights of delirium and silence across the Palatine. The emperor, who had been the people's darling, the savior, born of Germanicus, now lay between life and death, his skin pale as marble, his breath shallow and wet. Rome itself seemed to hold its breath with him. Temples overflowed with prayers, offerings burned through the night. Senators promised their fortunes, commoners wept in the streets. For weeks, the empire hovered between two worlds, one ruled by a mortal man, and another waiting for a god to awaken. When the fever broke, the city erupted in relief. Bells rang, incense curled above rooftops, and the Senate prepared to offer thanksgiving to the gods. But something had changed. The man who rose from that sickbed was not the same one who had fallen into it. His eyes, once full of charm and warmth, now glimmered with a cold, almost radiant intensity. He smiled often, but never at the right moments. He wept at laughter and laughed at funerals. The court whispered that Caligula had seen the underworld and returned not healed, but touched. At first, the changes seemed divine. He rebuilt temples, revived forgotten rituals, and declared that Rome's gods had spoken through him. He announced new festivals in their honor and presided over ceremonies wearing golden robes that shimmered like fire. The people adored it. Spectacle had always been Rome's truest language. When Caligula lifted his hands toward the sky, sunlight seemed to bend around him. He told the crowds he owed his life to Jupiter, and then, quietly, began to suggest he was Jupiter's equal. The Senate chuckled politely at first. It was not unusual for emperors to play at divinity. Augustus himself had been called the son of a god. But this was different. Caligula built shrines not beside the gods, but for himself. In the temple of Castor and Pollux, he ordered his statue placed between the twin deities. When a priest hesitated, Caligula asked, "Do you think the gods will be offended or relieved?" His laughter filled the marble chamber like thunder. The emperor's private world began to mirror the chaos of his mind. The palace became a labyrinth of mirrors and candles, corridors lined with perfumed smoke. Musicians played soft lyre songs at dawn, and by night the same halls echoed with screams. Those who flattered him lived like demigods. Those who hesitated vanished. To dine with Caligula was to gamble with the gods themselves. One senator, trembling, praised the emperor's beauty. Caligula leaned forward and said softly, "Then why do you avert your eyes? Look at me. Truly look." The man obeyed and was executed the next day for blasphemy. He began to blur every line between worship and cruelty, piety and indulgence. He would appear at banquets dressed as Apollo, or Venus, or Mars, each costume more extravagant than the last. One night, during a storm, he stepped onto the balcony in a golden cloak and shouted into the wind, "Be silent, Jupiter. Rome has a new thunderer now." The lightning struck close enough to split a pillar, and for days afterward he refused to leave the palace. Those around him saw the transformation and feared its contagion. His sister Drusilla alone seemed untouched by his rages. She was his mirror, his confidant, his forbidden sanctuary. Ancient whispers speak of a bond that crossed sacred boundaries, though none dared name it aloud. When she died, suddenly perhaps in childbirth, perhaps by his own command, Caligula's grief curdled into madness. He ordered her deified as Panthea, the universal goddess, and demanded the empire mourn her as a divine being. "If she is a goddess," he told the Senate, "then I am the god who made her so." From that day forward, worship of Caligula was no longer implied, it was enforced. Altars rose in his image. Priests were assigned to his cult. He demanded to be addressed not as princeps but as Dominus et Deus Lord and God. The Palatine no longer felt like a palace but a temple of flesh, where pleasure, terror, and devotion fused into one endless ritual. Senators kissed the ground before him, their voices trembling as they hailed his name. Those who faltered were struck down as heretics. And yet, in his divine theater, there were moments of strange tenderness. He would wander the halls at night, touching the marble faces of gods as if searching for kinship. "You understand, don't you?" he once murmured to a statue of Mars. "To be worshipped is to be alone." Outside, the empire glittered in forced celebration. Statues of the living god gleamed in every province. But beneath the gold, the people began to whisper prayers not for his life, but for his death. One night, as the torches along the Palatine guttered in the wind, a servant claimed to see the emperor kneeling before his own reflection, whispering a prayer no one could hear. His lips moved slowly, reverently, as though addressing something vast and unseen. Then he smiled the same eerie, distant smile that had followed him since the fever, and said to the empty air, "If I am divine, let the world prove it." Outside, thunder rolled again over Rome. The gods, it seemed, were listening. The streets of Rome no longer whispered, they moaned. From the Palatine to the Tiber, the air was thick with incense and fear. The city glimmered like a golden chalice filled with rot. In the emperor's shadow. The Senate learned to cheer through clenched teeth, and the people, once fed with bread and glory, were now fed with spectacle. The empire that had conquered the world was now devouring its own soul. Inside the palace, night never truly ended. The corridors burned with lamplight, silk curtains swaying like restless ghosts. Musicians played until their fingers bled. Dancers moved until they collapsed. Pleasure was no longer offered, it was demanded. Caligula's voice echoed through the marble chambers, rich and melodic, but laced with venom. "Am I not your god?" he would ask, his gaze sweeping across trembling courtiers. "Then why do you look away?" Senators bowed lower. Priests murmured oaths of divinity. And yet, beneath every act of devotion hid the same desperate question: how long before he turns his gaze on me? Caligula's imagination had become Rome's torment. He staged feasts that blurred into cruelty. Guests were summoned to banquets where gold dust covered the dishes, pearls dissolved into vinegar for his amusement. Once, when a senator praised the opulence, Caligula smiled and said, "Then let your wife match it." That night the woman was brought before the table, stripped of her dignity and paraded like another course to be consumed. Laughter filled the hall, but it was hollow, jagged, terrified. In the temples, he defiled what was sacred. Statues of gods were decapitated, their heads replaced with his own likeness. He commanded the high priestess to attend his private rituals naked, weeping, silent. He called it worship. Rome called it madness. Yet still no one stopped him. How could they? The Senate had long since traded virtue for survival, and the people hungry, awed, exhausted had learned to confuse power with holiness. The empire's wealth poured into his fantasies. He ordered ships joined together to form floating palaces across the bay of Naples, vessels draped in silk, their decks perfumed and glittering under torchlight. There, surrounded by music and waves, Caligula would feast and declaim as though Neptune himself were his guest. "The sea is mine," he shouted once, scooping handfuls of foam and casting them upon his guests. "Behold the spoils of the ocean." The courtiers applauded, afraid not to. Rome's senators watched as the treasury emptied, as taxes rose, as fear became the only currency left. Some tried to resist, quietly, cautiously, but resistance in Caligula's Rome was like whispering to a hurricane. One senator who questioned the emperor's divine status was forced to commit suicide, his property seized, his family erased from record. Another was invited to dinner, praised for loyalty, and found the next morning displayed in the forum, his severed head still wearing a laurel crown. And yet, through all the horror, the machine continued to turn. The empire functioned. The grain fleets sailed. The games went on. Because Rome had learned a terrible truth, that tyranny doesn't destroy systems, it feeds them. Caligula was not an aberration, he was their reflection. He ruled not by sword alone, but by permission, the quiet consent of those who feared losing comfort more than conscience. By the 4th year of his reign, the murmurs grew louder. In the barracks, soldiers grumbled over unpaid wages. In the Senate, eyes met in silence that smelled of conspiracy. Even within the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, there were whispers of the unthinkable. How many gods, they asked, had ever bled like men? It was in the chill of January 41st CE that the gods finally answered. Caligula entered a narrow passage after the games, laughter echoing off the stone. He had spent the morning mocking prophecies of his death, quoting them aloud for amusement. "Let them come," he said to his guards. "If fate is my assassin, I shall crown him." The words barely left his lips when the first blade struck. The corridors filled with screams and steel. The emperor fell amid his own echo, crimson blooming across the marble. The conspirators struck again and again, praetorians, senators, men who had once called him divine. When it was done, his body lay still, the god reduced to flesh, the flesh reduced to silence. But Rome did not weep. The city exhaled, and yet the air remained heavy, because even as his corpse cooled, a question lingered in every chamber, every temple, every heart. Was the madness truly gone, or had it simply changed its face? The Senate rushed to restore order, to erase his memory from monuments, to proclaim rebirth. Yet the machinery he built, the worship of power, the hunger for spectacle, the empire's dependence on its own delusion, remained untouched. Caligula's name would be damned, but his system endured. That night, as the torches burned low and the blood on the palace floor began to dry, an old senator looked toward the horizon and whispered, "Rome will survive him, but only by becoming him." Far away, thunder rolled across the hills. The empire that had eaten its god was already hungry again.